Okay, so today talking about specific parts of the brain, so that's the structure and then what they do, the function. So within your brain has evolved basically from the brain stem up. So down here where the pons, the reticular activating system, and the medulla and the cerebellum are, that stuff at the base of your neck, that's the brain stem. That is basically the parts of your brain that are going to be responsible for basic functions, things that you need to do to stay alive. And then as we became more advanced evolutionarily, your brain continued to evolve forward. And so we'll talk later about the parts of the brain, particularly those that are behind your forehead, for example, that represent the most evolved portions of the brain. But let's start first with the brain stem. So the pons, involved in your sleep-wake cycle and also involved in the experience of dreaming. The medulla then is involved in these automatic functions, things like your breathing and regulating your heart rate. So you need the medulla to be functioning in order to live. If you have damage to the medulla, you're going to die. The cerebellum, often called the little brain. So the cerebellum located at the base of the brainstem, and the cerebellum is particularly involved in helping you to have coordinated movement, particularly smooth movement, and also involved in helping you balance, so to be able to walk gracefully. The thalamus, also close to the brainstem here, moving into the center of the brain. The thalamus is responsible for taking in information using your senses, taking those messages and relaying them to the cerebral cortex. So you'll see that the cerebral cortex then is this outer covering of the brain. Cortex literally means bark, and it is the outer bark or the outer covering of the brain. The thalamus then is responsible for relaying all sensory information except your sense of smell. So your sense of smell is unique and processed by the olfactory bulb. The hypothalamus then and the pituitary gland, two other areas within the brain. So the hypothalamus, hypo literally means below, so the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. Hypothalamus is involved in the experience of emotion, also involved in drives that are necessary for your survival. So very primal drives like the experience of fear, hunger, thirst, and the drive for reproduction. The hypothalamus is also important in helping to regulate your autonomic nervous system. So remember, the autonomic nervous system is responsible for performing those automatic functions, and it's also responsible for helping you regulate your body temperature. The pituitary gland is actually part of the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is responsible for the secretion of hormones. And oftentimes the pituitary gland is called the master gland, in that it kind of oversees the other endocrine glands. And the pituitary gland you may have learned about before when you studied human sexuality. The pituitary gland is largely responsible for secreting those hormones that help to signal the start of puberty. The amygdala, responsible for the regulation of emotion, particularly the experience of fear and anger. So the amygdala then basically helps you appraise a situation. It helps you determine, is this something that I need to be scared of? Is this something that I need to become angry about? It kind of mobilizes you for action. So for example, let's say that you're walking home late at night and a very large figure is approaching you. From far away, you can't tell what it is, but it looks like this could be something that you should be scared of, right? This might be someone you don't know, maybe someone who wants to harm you. Your amygdala is basically working there to help you regulate your emotional response to that situation. It helps you generate that experience of fear, because if you're fearful in that situation, you need to mobilize your body, right? You need to mobilize your body's resources to get out of there, right? It's the fight or flight response. So are you going to stay and are you going to fight in this situation, or are you going to take flight? Literally, do you need to mobilize your body to get out of that situation? The hippocampus, a structure in the brain that is largely involved in the experience of long-term memories. So these are memories that are very stable in their duration. Hippocampus is also involved in helping you form spatial memories. So spatial memories are memories for basically how space is laid out. So let's say that you get up in the middle of the night to go get a drink of water. You don't turn the lights on, but you can still navigate through your bedroom, through your living room to get to the kitchen. You can still kind of remember where things are so you don't walk right into an end table and, stub your toe. That is because your hippocampus has formed a spatial memory for how your home is laid out. The cerebrum then is the largest of the brain structures. Your brain is divided into two halves or two hemispheres. And these hemispheres are lateralized, meaning that each hemisphere performs specialized functions, and we'll talk about some of those functions here in just a minute. And then the cerebrum is surrounded by the cerebral cortex, which we said is this bark, this covering. And it's actually this very thin layer of cells that appears gray when you look at it collectively, and that's where we get this term gray matter. The brain then, the two hemispheres, the two halves of your brain are connected so that they can communicate with one another. So the corpus callosum consists of these millions of myelinated axons. So remember, myelin is that fatty insulation that covers the axon that allows for neurons to communicate quickly. And this corpus callosum then are these millions of myelinated axons that connect these two brain hemispheres and allow both hemispheres to communicate with one another. The cerebral cortex, that bark, is divided into several different lobes, and we'll talk about each one of these lobes as they are involved in specific functions. So first, we have the occipital lobe, which is in the back of your brain, and the occipital lobe contains the visual cortex. So this is where visual information is processed. So this basically allows you to see. The frontal lobes then are involved in things like emotion, are involved in planning, creative thinking, and they also contain the motor cortex, so that's involved in movement. On the left side, we have a specific area called Broca's area that allows you to speak. This is involved in the production of speech. In the frontal lobes also, you have a very evolved area of your brain that's called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is a really exciting area, the most advanced from an evolutionary perspective. And for many of you, your prefrontal cortex is probably still developing, as this particular part of the brain is not finished developing until about your mid-20s. So the prefrontal cortex then is involved in things like judgment. It's involved in planning. It's involved in inhibiting one impulse to do something that's not quite as exciting. So your prefrontal cortex then helps you be able to make the decision to stay home and study because you have an exam tomorrow, instead of doing something that might be more fun, like going out with your friends and partying. So your prefrontal cortex is very, very much involved in that form of decision making. We also have your parietal lobes. So the parietal lobes toward the back of the brain, the posterior. The parietal lobes contain the somatosensory cortex. And the somatosensory cortex basically coordinates the experience of touch, basically, the experience that you have basically directly on the skin. So the experience of pain, the experience of pressure directly on the skin. The temporal lobes then, these are basically behind your temples. So the temporal lobes involved in memory, perception, emotion, and the coordination of auditory information, so hearing information. On the left side, we have Wernicke's area, which is involved in your ability to understand and comprehend language. One particular case that is very exciting in psychology is the case of Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage, as you will see in the video that you should watch after this, basically suffered damage to his prefrontal cortex. An explosion forced a steel rod directly through his head. You can see here in the picture that it went directly through the prefrontal cortex, and as a result, Gage suffered severe changes in behavior. In the video, they talk about him no longer being the same person. He could no longer hold his job as a foreman, which requires things like these planning, judgment, and impulse control skills. He could no longer do those skills after suffering damage to the prefrontal cortex.